Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, the truth behind their deaths. There are few love stories in history that changed the course of an entire nation. Most romances remain private, remembered only by families or close friends. But every so often, a relationship becomes so extraordinary that it alters politics, reshapes institutions, and leaves questions that continue to echo decades after the people involved are gone. The story of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson is one of those rare stories. For generations, millions of people have heard the familiar version. A king falls deeply in love with an American woman who has been divorced. Faced with a choice between the British throne and the woman he cannot imagine living without, he chooses love. He walks away from a crown that countless men throughout history would have sacrificed everything to obtain. Newspapers describe it as the greatest royal romance of the 20th century. Films, documentaries, and novels often portray it as a heartbreaking fairy tale where love triumphs over duty. But history is rarely that simple. Behind the famous photographs, behind the elegant clothing, the dazzling jewels, and the glamorous parties attended by kings, queens, diplomats, and celebrities, another story was unfolding. It was a story filled with political tension, loneliness, public criticism, failing health, family divisions, and years of emotional isolation. The final chapters of Edward and Wallis's lives would become far quieter than the dramatic headlines that once followed them across the world. When Edward VIII died in 1972, many newspapers focused on the king who gave up everything for love, yet historians quickly began asking different questions. Had years of stress slowly destroyed his health? Did exile from Britain affect him more deeply than anyone realized? Was the emotional burden of living outside the royal family greater than he ever admitted? Then 14 years later, Wallis Simpson also died. Her final years were surrounded by silence. She disappeared almost completely from public life. Friends became increasingly rare. Rumors spread throughout Europe regarding her condition. Some claimed she had become a prisoner inside her own home. Others insisted she no longer understood the world around her. Still, others believed powerful people controlled access to her during her final years. The contrast between their glamorous youth and their quiet endings fascinated historians. How could two people who once stood at the center of the world's attention vanish into such isolation? To understand the truth behind their deaths, it is necessary to begin much earlier. Edward was born into extraordinary privilege. From the moment he entered the world in June 1894, almost every aspect of his future had already been decided. He belonged to one of the most powerful royal families on earth. His grandmother was Queen Victoria, whose empire stretched across continents. Expectations surrounded him from childhood. Like many royal children of his generation, Edward experienced a strict upbringing. Emotional warmth was often replaced by discipline and duty. Public appearances mattered. Reputation mattered. Personal feelings usually came last. As a young prince, Edward became enormously popular. He possessed charm, confidence, and remarkable social skills, Crowds admired his appearance and effortless ability to connect with ordinary people. Unlike many members of the aristocracy, he seemed approachable, yet beneath that confident exterior, many people close to him noticed signs of restlessness. He disliked rigid traditions. He questioned established customs. Royal life sometimes felt more like a prison than a privilege. These characteristics would eventually shape one of the greatest constitutional crises in British history. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, another life was unfolding under completely different circumstances. Wallis Warfield was born in Pennsylvania in 1896. Unlike Edward, she entered a world without palaces, crowns, or enormous wealth. Her family faced financial uncertainty, and her early years required resilience rather than luxury. She developed intelligence, determination, and exceptional social awareness. Friends often described her as witty, observant, and capable of adapting to almost any situation. She understood how people behaved within elite social circles long before she ever entered them herself. Her life would eventually bring her into contact with diplomats, wealthy businessmen, aristocrats, and eventually royalty. Before meeting Edward, Wallis experienced 2 marriages. Her first marriage ended in divorce. Her second husband was Ernest Simpson, a successful businessman. It was through London's sophisticated social world that Wallis first encountered the Prince of Wales. No one present during those early meetings could have imagined the consequences. At first, Wallis was simply another guest among many attending fashionable dinners and private gatherings. Edward was accustomed to meeting attractive, intelligent women. Nothing immediately suggested that this relationship would become different. Yet over time, something changed. Edward appeared increasingly fascinated by Wallis. Unlike many people who surrounded him, she did not treat him like a future king. She challenged him. She joked with him. She spoke honestly. She seemed unimpressed by titles. For a man who had spent his entire life being admired because of his position, this was deeply refreshing. As their friendship grew stronger, concern quietly spread within royal circles. Senior officials began noticing how frequently Edward invited Wallis to private events. Members of the royal household exchanged uncomfortable conversations. Diplomats observed the growing relationship carefully. At first, few believed it posed a genuine danger. After all, future kings had often enjoyed romantic relationships before marriage. But gradually it became obvious that Edward's feelings were becoming far more serious. Then history changed forever. In January 1936, King George V died. Edward automatically became King Edward VIII. He finally possessed the crown he had prepared for throughout his entire life. Yet almost immediately, an impossible dilemma emerged. The new king wanted to marry Wallis Simpson. For ordinary people, such a decision might have attracted gossip. For the British monarch, it threatened the stability of the constitutional system itself. As supreme governor of the Church of England, the king occupied a religious role as well as a political one. At that time, marrying a twice-divorced woman whose former husbands were still alive created enormous legal, religious, and political difficulties. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made the government's position clear. Neither Parliament nor the governments across the British Empire would support such a marriage while Edward remained king. Edward believed compromise might be possible. Perhaps Wallis could become his wife without becoming queen. Perhaps another legal arrangement could satisfy everyone. But discussions repeatedly reached dead ends. The crisis grew larger with every passing week. Interestingly, much of the British public initially knew very little about the developing scandal. British newspapers largely avoided reporting the relationship out of respect for long-established conventions involving the monarchy. Foreign newspapers, however, especially in the United States, discussed it openly. Eventually, the story became impossible to hide. Pressure intensified from every direction. Government ministers warned of constitutional chaos. Church leaders expressed opposition. Members of Edward's own family worried about the monarchy's future. Meanwhile, Wallis herself appeared deeply conflicted. Contrary to later romantic portrayals, evidence suggests she sometimes considered ending the relationship. She understood the enormous consequences. She realized millions of people blamed her for a national crisis. Letters from the period reveal emotional exhaustion rather than triumph. As the weeks passed, Edward faced perhaps the most difficult decision of his life. Duty or love, crown or companionship. History would remember only the final choice, but few people truly appreciated the emotional turmoil that preceded it. On the evening before his abdication, Edward reportedly understood that nothing would ever return to normal. Even if he remained king, public confidence had been damaged. Even if he surrendered the throne, life would never again resemble what it once had been. He stood at the edge of history. The decision he made would transform not only his own future, but also that of his younger brother, Albert, who would become King George VI. That unexpected change would eventually place a young princess named Elizabeth much closer to the throne than anyone had anticipated. Without Edward's abdication, the reign of Queen Elizabeth II might never have happened in the way history remembers it today. But those consequences belonged to the future. For Edward himself, only uncertainty lay ahead. He was about to exchange Buckingham Palace for exile, royal authority for private freedom, national responsibility for personal devotion. Many believed happiness awaited him. Few realized that the hardest years of his life had not yet begun. On the evening of December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the document that formally ended his reign. With a few strokes of a pen, a king who had ruled the British Empire for less than a year surrendered the crown forever. The following day, he addressed the nation by radio, delivering one of the most famous speeches in royal history. His words would become legendary. He explained that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of kingship without the help and support of the woman I love. For millions listening across Britain and throughout the empire, it was an astonishing moment. Never before had a British monarch voluntarily stepped away from the throne for personal reasons. Some listeners admired his honesty. Others believed he had abandoned a sacred duty. across the country. Conversations erupted in homes, workplaces, and newspapers. Was Edward a hopeless romantic, or had he placed his own happiness above the stability of the nation? History has debated that question ever since. Once the abdication became official, Edward was no longer king. Instead, he received the title Duke of Windsor. Although the title preserved his royal status, it also marked the beginning of a very different life. He would never again hold constitutional power. He would never again make decisions on behalf of Britain. The palace that had once been his home was suddenly behind him. The separation from his family proved especially painful. His younger brother, now King George VI, faced the enormous responsibility of leading the monarchy through uncertain times. The relationship between the brothers became strained. While affection remained, trust had been damaged. Many members of the royal family believed Edward had placed them in an impossible position. For Edward, those feelings were difficult to accept. He believed he had followed his conscience. Others believed he had failed in his duty. That disagreement would never completely disappear. Meanwhile, Wallis Simpson found herself at the center of worldwide attention, unlike anything she had ever imagined. Newspapers published photographs of her almost daily. Every dress she wore, every public appearance she made, and every expression on her face became international news. Yet fame came at a heavy price. Many people blamed her entirely for the constitutional crisis. Some portrayed her as an ambitious social climber determined to capture a king. Others insisted she had manipulated Edward for wealth, influence, or prestige. Rumors spread constantly, often without evidence. Stories appeared claiming she possessed extraordinary control over Edward's emotions. Modern historians generally paint a more complicated picture. Letters and eyewitness accounts suggest that Wallis often felt overwhelmed by the attention. She had never expected to become one of the most controversial women in the world. In private, she reportedly worried about the damage done to Edward's reputation and wondered whether history would ever judge her fairly. In June 1937, Edward and Wallis were finally married in France. The wedding was elegant, but noticeably absent of one important group. No senior members of the British royal family attended. Their absence spoke louder than any public statement. Although Edward remained the Duke of Windsor, relationships inside the royal family remained deeply strained. Wallis was not granted the style of Her Royal Highness, a decision that deeply hurt Edward. He believed his wife deserved equal recognition. The royal household strongly disagreed. This disagreement created resentment that would last for decades. The newly married couple settled into a life that seemed glamorous from the outside. They traveled across Europe, attended fashionable parties, and spent time with wealthy friends. Photographs showed elegant clothes, luxurious homes, and smiling faces, but appearances often concealed reality. Without official royal duties, Edward struggled to define his purpose. For decades, nearly every hour of his life had been planned around public service. Suddenly, he possessed almost unlimited freedom, but very little responsibility. For some people, that might have sounded ideal. For Edward, it sometimes became deeply frustrating. Friends later described him as restless. He enjoyed social events, but they could not replace the sense of importance that had once accompanied his position as heir to the throne. He missed Britain. He missed royal ceremonies. Most of all, he missed feeling useful. Wallis noticed these changes. She reportedly encouraged him to remain active, meet influential people, and stay engaged with international affairs. Yet she could not restore the role he had lost. The late 1930s also brought growing political tensions across Europe. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany. International relations were becoming increasingly dangerous. Many European leaders underestimated the scale of the threat that Nazi Germany represented. In 1937, Edward and Wallis accepted an invitation to visit Germany. That journey would become one of the most controversial episodes of Edward's entire life. They toured factories, met government officials, and eventually held a meeting with Adolf Hitler himself. Photographs from the visit spread rapidly around the world. Critics argued that the visit gave legitimacy to the Nazi regime at a time when Germany's aggressive policies were becoming increasingly clear. Supporters claimed Edward believed diplomacy and dialogue might preserve peace. Even today, historians continue to debate Edward's motives. Some believe he was politically naive. Others argue that he sincerely hoped another devastating European war could be avoided. There is little evidence that he fully understood the horrors that the Nazi regime would later unleash across Europe. Nevertheless, the visit severely damaged his public reputation. When the Second World War began in 1939, questions about Edward's political judgment returned with renewed intensity. The British government became concerned that his public statements or international connections might unintentionally create political complications. As German forces advanced across Europe, Edward and Wallis left France and eventually reached Portugal. For a brief period, uncertainty surrounded their future. British officials worried that Nazi Germany might attempt to use Edward for propaganda. German intelligence reportedly believed that the former king might be useful in encouraging Britain to negotiate peace. Whether Edward himself had any intention of cooperating remains heavily debated. To remove any possibility of political exploitation, the British government arranged a new role for him. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas. The assignment placed him thousands of miles away from Europe and from the center of wartime politics. For Edward, it felt like exile once again. He privately described the Bahamas as dull and isolated. He believed the appointment was far beneath the responsibilities he once expected as king. Wallis also struggled to adapt to life on the islands. The glamorous social circles of Paris and London were replaced by a quiet colonial administration far from international attention. Despite these frustrations, Edward carried out his duties. He met local officials, inspected public projects, and represented the British government during the war years. Some historians credit him with taking certain administrative responsibilities seriously, while others argue that his enthusiasm remained limited. The experience highlighted a recurring theme in Edward's life. He constantly searched for meaning after giving up the throne. No position ever truly replaced what he had lost. As the war ended and Europe slowly rebuilt itself, Edward and Wallis returned to France. Paris became their permanent home. They settled into a comfortable existence, surrounded by fashionable friends, elegant dinners, and high society. To many outsiders, their lives appeared almost perfect. Yet beneath that polished surface, emotional wounds remained. Edward still hoped for greater acceptance from the British royal family. Wallis hoped public hostility would eventually disappear. Neither wish would be fully realized. The distance between the Duke and the monarchy remained. The memories of the abdication crisis never completely faded, and as the years passed, another challenge quietly emerged, one that neither wealth, fame, nor royal titles could prevent. Time. The couple who had once shocked the world was growing older. The energy of youth gradually gave way to the realities of aging. Small health problems began to appear. At first, they seemed insignificant. No one imagined they marked the beginning of the final chapter of one of history's most extraordinary love stories. As the 1960s came to an end, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were no longer the glamorous couple who had once dominated newspaper headlines around the world. Age had changed everything. The parties became fewer. International travel became more difficult. Many of the friends who had surrounded them during their most famous years had either passed away or withdrawn from public life. Their world grew much smaller. Edward's health, which had appeared reasonably stable for many years, began to decline rapidly. For decades, he had been a heavy smoker. Like millions of people of his generation, smoking had been considered fashionable rather than dangerous during his youth. By the time medical science clearly linked tobacco to serious diseases, the damage had already been done. In 1971, doctors diagnosed Edward with throat cancer. The diagnosis was devastating. Although treatment was available, cancer had already taken a significant toll on his health. Surgery and medical care offered only limited hope. His physical strength continued to fade. One particularly meaningful event occurred shortly before his death. In May 1972, visited Edward and Wallis at their home in Paris during an official trip to France. It was the first time in many years. The visit symbolized a measure of reconciliation after decades of distance between Edward and the royal family. Only days later, on May 28, 1972, Edward died at the age of 77. What was the real cause of Edward VIII's death? The historical evidence is remarkably clear. Edward died from complications related to throat cancer, a disease strongly associated with his long history of cigarette smoking. There is no credible historical evidence that he was assassinated, poisoned, or secretly murdered. Over the years, conspiracy theories have suggested that powerful figures wanted him silenced because of political controversies or alleged wartime secrets. However, historians have found no reliable documentation supporting these claims. His illness had been publicly known, and his decline was witnessed by doctors, nurses, family members, and close friends. The simplest explanation is also the one supported by the evidence. Edward died after a prolonged battle with cancer. After his death, his body was returned to Britain. He was buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore near Windsor Castle. For the first time in decades, the former king rested once again on British soil. For Wallis Simpson, Edward's death marked the end of the relationship that had defined nearly 40 years of her life. Although the world remembered her as the woman for whom a king surrendered his crown, she now faced old age alone. At first she continued living in Paris, but gradually her health also declined. Unlike Edward, Wallis's final years were surrounded by far more mystery, not because historians doubt the medical cause of her death, but because she became almost completely isolated from public life. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, she appeared less frequently in public. Friends reported that she became increasingly frail. Eventually, she required constant care. Rumors began circulating throughout Europe. Some claimed she'd become incapable of making decisions. Others alleged that people close to her controlled access to her home and finances. These stories created another wave of speculation. However, separating fact from rumor is important. Historical evidence indicates that Wallis experienced severe physical decline during her final years. She spent much of her time confined to bed and required continuous medical attention. While there were legal disputes and questions surrounding her estate and those managing her affairs, these controversies are not evidence that she was murdered or deliberately harmed. On April 24, 1986, Wallis Simpson died in Paris at the age of 89. What was the real cause of Wallis Simpson's death? Unlike Edward, Wallis did not die from a single dramatic illness such as cancer. Historical accounts describe her death as the result of complications associated with advanced age and prolonged ill health after years of physical decline. Again, conspiracy theories have claimed that hidden political forces or financial motives played a role. No convincing historical evidence supports those claims. Most professional historians conclude that Wallis died after years of declining health, not as the victim of a secret plot. After her death, her body was taken to Britain. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore. The couple whose love had once shaken the British monarchy were reunited in death. Looking back across the decades, one question still captures people's imagination. Was it worth it? Did Edward make the right decision? History cannot answer that question with certainty. Supporters argue that he followed his heart and chose the person he truly loved. Critics argue that he abandoned responsibilities that came with the crown. Both perspectives continue to exist. What history can say with confidence is something simpler. Edward VIII did not die because of a royal conspiracy. He died from throat cancer after years of heavy smoking. Wallis Simpson did not die as the victim of a proven secret assassination. She died after a long period of declining health in old age. Their deaths were not as dramatic as the rumors that followed them. Yet perhaps that is the greatest irony of their story. Their lives were defined by extraordinary public drama, while their final years were marked by silence. The king who gave up an empire for love spent much of his later life longing for acceptance. The woman blamed for changing British history spent her last years largely hidden from the world. Their names remain inseparable from one of the most famous abdications in history. But their deaths remind us that behind every legend are two human beings who grew old, became ill, and eventually passed away. The myths surrounding their final years continue to fascinate people, but the historical record points toward a quieter truth. Sometimes history's greatest mysteries are not solved by discovering secret conspiracies. Sometimes they are solved by accepting the evidence that has been there all along.